Welcome to Inside Asia, an SEB podcast about Asian economies and financial markets. My name is Sean Yokota, Head of Markets for Asia, and with me on this pod, I have Fredrik Hähnel, Head of Asia and General Manager of SEB Singapore. Hi, Fredrik.
Hi, Sean. Good to be back. It's been a while. We've been busy.
Hey, Fredrik, I hear you have a cold. Is that something you caught on your trip?
Yeah, I caught that when skiing in China. It was almost 3 weeks ago it started, but unfortunately it's continued. I'll do my best today anyway.
Yeah, we're going to start off this new year, 2024. And as always, I think China is going to be a big topic today. Stock market's having some problems recently. It's getting global attention. And then we'll also talk a little bit about Taiwan's election and the implication to the world. Because unfortunately, global conflict, it started in Ukraine. It's kind of spread to Israel, Gaza, and then it's spreading to the other parts of the Middle East. And when we talk about geopolitical risk here in the region, it's always surrounded around Taiwan Straits. So I think we have to talk about the election that came up in Taiwan and the implications. Let's just start with Fredrik. What have you been up to in the last month or two?
Right. So I came back a few weeks ago from China and Hong Kong, where I spent my Christmas vacation. I started in Hong Kong and then later flew up to North China, close to Jilin, in Jilin province, not far from the North Korean border, actually, where I went skiing, which was really great. I didn't know, but skiing in China is very good. The slopes were great, and we had a lot of snow, and it was very cold and nice. So that was great. And it's very cheap in China. That's something that struck me. While the rest of the world has had, in many countries, 20, 30% inflation sort of over these past few years, China hasn't had any inflation, so it's relatively speaking become much cheaper than other places. And also, it was nice to see, when skiing, that the service sector is actually, at least that was anecdotal kind of evidence, that the service sector is doing quite well in China, while of course the manufacturing sector is struggling, which we may come back to in this pod. Apart from that, I visited Japan and India before Christmas. Japan, very interesting. Geopolitically very well positioned as a strategic partner of the US. The economy is doing very well. The stock market is just going to new all-time highs over and over right now. The property market in big cities looks pretty good. The economy is good. There's no unemployment and inflation is back. So the big question there, of course, when will they exit their yield control scheme? And India, also we talked about India in our one of our earlier podcasts, and that was very interesting to visit after that. And I did get very positive and bullish when there. When I met with our clients in India, they sound today very much what they sounded like 10, 15 years ago in China when I met them at that time. Very bullish on sales in the coming years. They're planning to invest more, etc. And you look around in India, you see a lot of infrastructure investments, digitization of the economy. Roughly half of the world's digital payments are taking place in India. And we have an upcoming election, which looks like Modi is going to go for a third period as head of India. Back to you, Sean. What is the latest in financial markets?
Yeah, the financial markets, the world is split. So you have one side, the US stock market, making all new time highs when you have a Goldilocks of inflation coming down and growth doing pretty well. And then on the other side of the world, where we are, China's stock market, it just keeps on falling. Today, it's January 23rd, we're recording this in the afternoon in Singapore. They just came out with some measures, supported the equity market, but it's been a tough ride. So starting in this decade, let's say 2020, Shanghai's market has been down 5% over the last almost 4 years. But if you look at the US S&P, it's up 50%. So before China, it was led by the fears in the property sector, developers having issues, but this negative sentiment has spread to the general stock market. And now it's getting to the point where our global investors, I think, are getting nervous that something negative is brewing in China.
And let's see if this is sort of what's going to turn the Chinese government, because everyone is waiting for them to stimulate more, right? And some people also think that if markets go down far enough, that they will actually make a move and come back with stimulative measures.
Yeah, and I think it's a question of whether this is a symptom or this is the cause, the fall in the stock market. And I see it more as a symptom where, in the end, I think China has number one issue is this uncertainty in the future of China, where the leaders want to steer the country. And we talked on this podcast many times before about President Xi and how he's changed the focus of China from economy was what it was for the last 50 years was number one priority, but he's added security into this, and it's just always a matter of how much. Does that mean security is 100%, economy is zero, or is it 10, 20? What is that relationship? And until I think that is clarified and everybody understand it, even the leaders understand it, local governments, they don't know what to implement. And then with this ambiguity, I think that's making people nervous about China's future. And so a good example was last week, China was supposed to cut one of its interest rates just by 10 basis points. And everybody thought they were going to cut. And then they surprised the market by not cutting. And so 10 basis points, it doesn't make a big difference, but it's just a reminder of just the unpredictability of the leadership. And I think that's going to be tough. So yeah, we'll come back to China later on, but first we wanted to talk a bit about the Taiwan elections. This was about 2 weeks ago. Taiwan had its presidential election, and I just want to kind of lay out the background on the outcome. So first, it was a three-person race, three-party race, and then the incumbent party and the current vice president William Lai from the DPP, he won with 40% of the votes. The other big opposition, it's called Kuomintang, KMT, they got 33%. And then the third party called Taiwan People's Party got 26%. So William Lai's party is the one that is pro-independence of Taiwan. So in other words, a bit anti-China. And then his party, DPP, they won the last three presidential elections in a row, which might be a bit concerning for China. But one kind of good thing that happened for China was that at the same time they had the legislative elections. And there, this anti-China DPP party lost some seats, and the opposition they gained not just a majority and gained 15 seats. But overall, the election results were it wasn't a big surprise. It was what people were expecting, according to the polls.
Yeah, and maybe this was the optimal turnout, considering that we knew already before this election that William Lai probably would win, right? And but I think for China and for the Chinese leadership in Beijing, of course, this is in a way it's an easy explanation they can now get, and which has also been their narrative when communicating about this, right? That the fact that neither William Lai nor DPP did get absolute majority, they can claim that none of them is actually kind of representing the majority of the Taiwanese people. So I think it's been in that sense a better than expected result, maybe, if you will, and hence it's been rather calm from China's side since then. But I think everything depends now on what does William Lai say between now and when he actually starts as president in May, and also what will be comments or visits from the U.S. That's what's more sensitive for China. So it remains to be seen, but it's been rather calm so far.
Like you said, I think the key is that it does prolong the status quo, and kind of the risks of a conflict or some kind of escalation is somewhat reduced. Although, like you said, we never know what's going to happen in the next couple months, but that's good to know. Fredrik, do you want to just kind of give us a historical context on Taiwan?
I think that everyone should remember that Taiwan, first of all, is a very young democracy. Um, Taiwan was occupied by the Japanese in 1895 when China lost the Sino-Japanese War, and Japan then basically occupied Taiwan all the way up until the end of the Second World War. And after that, as I think most people know, war broke out between the communists and the nationalists in China. And after the communists won in 1949, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek then fled to Taiwan to set up what then became the Republic of China, while the communists in China, announced the founding of the People's Republic of China. And then these two sort of lived alongside each other since then, basically. And Taiwan, after 1949, actually was under martial law all the way up until 1987. And after that, the democratization began, which led up to the first direct president election or presidential election in 1996. And when you look at the relations between Taiwan and mainland China, now they are, I would say, on a record low level. But if you go back and it's sort of shifted over time, and there was a time after 1992 when there was a consensus, and it's called the 1992 consensus between the communist government in Beijing and the then KMT, as we call it, the nationalist government in Taipei, where both parties agreed that there's only one China, but they disagreed on what that means. Did it mean the Republic, the People's Republic of China, or did it mean the Republic of China, which was basically in Taiwan? And after that, there was an economic downturn that followed and led to criticism among many voters in Taiwan that Taipei had gone too far and sort of come too close to Beijing and asked for more of a pro-independence movement, which then Tsai Ing-wen led when she won and became the president as a leader of the DPP 8 years ago. And then she also openly refused to accept this 1992 consensus, while Beijing instead regarded her as a separatist. And since then, basically, there's been no real communication between these two, between the Communist Party in China and the DPP. And I think also these tensions increased when she won again the second period, after the anti-government protests took place in Hong Kong in 2019, because I think then a lot of people in Taiwan also saw that they were not ready for any kind of reunification with the mainland China that would mean that Taiwan would become more like China. They had gotten used to a lot of a completely different political system. So that is a little bit of a background.
Yeah, so I think when we talk about China, Taiwan, like you said, this 1992 consensus is like that's kind of the stake in the ground, and things kind of revolve around that. And yeah, it's kind of like husband and wife relationship of agreeing to disagree. Let's just disagree on this, but move on and talk about everything else that we can talk about. So that's very important. But I mean, I think some of the things got worse or interpreted, I think, with the China or the US community as well, when Xi Jinping kind of brought up a couple of dates related to China and Taiwan. So one is 2027, when she's kind of instructed the People's Liberation Army in China to have the capability to fight and win a regional conflict. And then, of course, regional conflict, people just kind of assume it's somewhere in the Taiwan Strait. So that's only 3 years away, and that's kind of pushed up the timeline. And another big one was 2049, which is 25 years away. It's kind of tied to Xi's linking unification to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So I think those two things kind of worried people that the Taiwan timeline can be moved up. Is that something you see as well?
Beijing clearly sees, as we know, Taiwan as a part of China, to be reunited, preferably by peaceful means, but by force if necessary. So that's what Xi Jinping has come back to. And if you listen to his speeches, he's very, very, very clear about this. But if you look at what the rest of the world says, most countries, including the US, don't recognize Taiwan as an independent state anymore. There are only 12 states left that recognize Taiwan diplomatically, and they're quite small countries, the biggest one being Guatemala. So that's the case. But the US at the same time is opposed to any attempt to take Taiwan by force. They're providing Taiwan with military equipment, and they have several times said that they are committed to support Taiwan in case there would be military conflict. But if you look at Taiwan itself, it's quite interesting to see how things are shifting there too. There was a poll by the Taiwanese government Mainland Affairs Council, I think it was last year, that showed that only 7% of the Taiwanese population actually supported reunification. 25% were in favor of independence, but the big majority was actually in favor of status quo. That's quite interesting to see as well. For the US, Taiwan is increasingly becoming an important democratic partner in this part of the world, a tool, if you will, for the US to counter China's geopolitical weight in the region. So that's something to keep in mind. Another one is, of course, you can't talk about Taiwan without mentioning semiconductors. Taiwan produces some 60% of, high-end semiconductors in the world, and TSMC, the big company, semiconductor manufacturing company itself, holds some 50% of global share of all these high-level semiconductors production in the world. And both the US and China are actually in huge need of these semiconductors for manufacturing of smartphones, computers, fighter jets, cars, etc., etc. And so that's quite interesting. And for example, when Pelosi, visited Taiwan in 2022, when we saw all these, tension and the military exercises by China outside of Taiwan, one of the visits she made was actually to TSMC. Yeah, there's a lot of things going on at the same time here. I think, and it's a complicated issue. We could talk forever about it, but yeah, it's definitely something we will need to keep an eye on during this year. That's for sure. And this is the one of the most important democratic elections in the region. But there are many more to come as well in India and Indonesia, to name a few.
I mean, from my side, I think China's worried about Taiwan election. The biggest thing is that they have a Chinese province and they have a freely elected election. It's very peaceful. Change of power is done peacefully, and economically they are successful, moving up the value chain very well. And I think they don't want those ideas being shifted over where people in the mainland start thinking, oh, why can't we have elections as well? So I feel like that's the main one they want to control in terms of spreading and kind of staying in power and promoting stability. So let's move from what's happening in Taiwan over to the mainland in China. And then, Frederick, I guess you made quite a bit of stop inside mainland China. So can you give us a big
Some travel impressions.
yes?
Yeah, I mean, I started by spending Christmas actually in Hong Kong, which was very nice. Such a nice city where I lived for many years before Singapore. After Hong Kong, I actually took the train from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, where you pass through this manufacturing mecca of Guangdong province, and in particular the city of Dongguan, where so many manufacturers are located for exports out of China. So I kind of got a glimpse into that before I went north to go skiing, and sort of saw the other part of the Chinese economy a little bit, the service sector, as I mentioned at the beginning. On that trip, it was very obvious these problems that we have discussed in this podcast with China's property sector challenges and the property sector crisis. You could really see on the way from Hong Kong to Guangzhou with so many. Even though I knew it was bad, it was still very surprising for me. You see so many empty buildings, so many buildings under construction in spite of the big oversupply of apartments and housing in China. We mentioned in an earlier pod that there is somewhere between 70 and 100 million too many flats in China, and that's sort of almost the equivalent of all the flats there are in the United States. So that was something that was very obvious to me. And then the other thing that I contemplated a little bit around was the manufacturing sector, which you could see down there. I mean, Dongguan is a manufacturing center, and China is really struggling because, I mean, the last year we're all surprised by how strong the world economy has been. But part of the reason it's kept up so well is, of course, that the service economy has been quite strong, and also in China the service economy is not that bad actually when you look around. But the manufacturing sector is struggling, and of course that hits China more because China stands for such a large part of manufacturing of goods in the world. When you look at manufacturing of goods, China actually stands for roughly 30% of the value of that manufacturing globally. You see these challenges in the property sector when you visit China. You see the challenges in the manufacturing or the goods manufacturing sector, but you also see quite upbeat in the service sector.
And I guess what investors and corporate executives want to know is there anything China can do about these sectors? So if we kind of divide this up, service sector, it's actually doing very well. It's going to do well. So we don't really have to worry too much about that. And so the other two are one is the property market, and second one is manufacturing. So maybe we can start with the property market. Is there anything that the government can do or will do in this year of the dragon coming up?
First of all, I think it's becoming more and more obvious to everyone that the problems with China's property sector will take a long, long time to solve. China has so much oversupply that this is not going to be a quick fix. This is probably going to take. I mean, anyone's guess, probably better than mine. But I would say that it may very well be 10 years or something like that before China finds a balance in the property sector with its oversupply, and the inventory is coming down. So that will probably be a drag on the sentiment and consumption in China for many years. But at the same time, it's gone pretty far already, and I think there's increasingly an urgency for the Chinese government to put a floor to the current crisis in one way or another. And I read a pretty interesting report over the weekend written by GovCal that I found quite interesting. But they were basically comparing the property crisis in China today to the equivalent of a financial crisis. And they said typically in a financial crisis, one factor will be that there's a bank run, that you will see depositors taking out their money from the banks because they don't trust that the banks are safe. And when they do so, the situation gets even worse for the banks because they don't have access to funding and liquidity. And they compare this to the property sector because they say in China, of course, this doesn't happen in the financial sector because it's to a very large extent dominated by state-owned banks. Some 80-90% or so of all assets in the banking sector are within the state-owned part of the financial sector in China, and hence you have an implicit guarantee from the government that the money is safe. But if you look at the property sector, it's completely the opposite. It's a lot of private players, and there's a lot of smaller players as well in this sector. And the core, and this is again I'm referring to this report by GovCal, the core of the problem, the way they describe it, is of course these prepayments of apartments under construction in China. And they said that this is not something new. You have this in many other markets around the world. The difference is that in other markets, you usually you make a down payment and then you make the rest of the payment when the apartment is ready. Whilst in China, actually, people pay the entire amount at the beginning and then they take the risk of the apartment not being finalized. And this worked for a long time until it didn't anymore, right? So the problem now is that there's a lot of debt from these property developers to individuals in China that have not seen their flats being finalized. And now, of course, there's this equal to a financial crisis where depositors don't dare to put in their deposits. Individuals in China today don't dare to buy in this market new flats, basically, because they don't dare to take that risk that maybe this particular developer will simply not exist anymore when before the flat is actually finalized. So, and you can see this also in the number of transactions in China, according to GovCal, that actually the number of secondary transactions in the market has not gone down even close to the number of transactions in the primary market. So basically, it's the problem. The core of the problem is within this part of the property sector where people are prepaying or now not anymore willing to prepay for apartments under construction. So they had a number of gestures of how could this potentially be, how could you finally put a floor to this crisis? And one way could be to sort of make it compulsory to buy an insurance when you prepay a flat, so that you have an insurance that in case the flat is not finalized, you will get paid by this insurance. And then the question will be who will issue such an insurance? Would it be the government that's behind this, or who would it be? Another sort of suggestion could be that state-owned property developers take over these projects entirely or acquire many of these private developers, and then you kind of gradually solve the issue that way. I have no idea myself which one is best, but it was an interesting take, and I think that now with equity markets that you mentioned at the beginning being down so much and the property sector being in such dire straits, we should expect some more important actions being taken by the government during this year, and one cornerstone of this should be addressing this problem with the prepaid flats.
Yeah, based on what you just said, I see two implications. The first one is, like you said, this is going to be a change in process of the entire market. So, like you said, it's going to be a very long time before it's fixed, but it is a long term adjustment. So, there's no shock therapy. And then the second thing is that you are the one reason why property did so well was because it was 100% publicly managed in the 70s, and then they kind of opened it up to the private sector all of a sudden. And that privatization itself, that's what made it grow very fast as well. And they're able to build so quickly, which was a positive for growth. But now, if you're going to go back to a kind of a public sector led industry, that means the growth is going to slow down quite a bit. So, yeah. Oh, overall in the Chinese economy, well, it's exactly what they want, but they have property is going to be a much smaller player in the entire picture. Okay, let's go to the next problem to solve here. It's the manufacturing sector in that you saw problems in Guangdong and how that can be fixed. Because I mean there are kind of two sides to this. One is that or China's days of being the world's factory is that over, and we had some foreign direct investment numbers that came out recently, and it just showed for all of 2023, it was down 8% versus the previous year. And it hasn't been negative since over 10 years. So you can kind of see the sentiment of foreigners investing into China to do manufacturing has been going down. And then the second thing about this is that EU China tensions, they're picking up because of, well, in the end, it's a trade deficit issue in that Europe is buying more things from China than China is buying from Europe, and that's beginning to widen and widen. And there seems to be no end in sight, so this is leading to conflicts. So, Frederick, can you tackle this issue? How do we solve this manufacturing issue?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit unfair in this pod, Jean. I'm asked to sort of come up with all the solutions and predictions here. I don't have any solutions or prediction, but I think this. Let's talk a little bit about the EU-China relations because I recently met with the new chairman of the EU Chamber, and he shared some quite interesting info from a survey that they did recently among their members that shows that the bigger picture is that kind of low end manufacturing seems to be leaving China, and that China is not really worried about that because high value manufacturing remains in China and actually helps China to achieve its goal of moving up the value chain. I find that quite interesting. And if you look at the numbers from this survey, 12% of the members say that they have already moved supply chains or are planning to move supply chains out of China. And I should say these numbers are reasonably similar to other surveys among in the American or in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China. So 12% of members say that they've already moved supply chains, but that is mainly due to increased labor unit costs, which have shot up in China to roughly $8 per hour versus $2 to $3 in parts of Southeast Asia. When asked sort of those moving out, where did they go? 27% said Southeast Asia or the ASEAN countries, basically. 21% went to Europe, 15% went to India, 12% went to the US. So this China plus one strategy that we have discussed earlier is clearly also benefiting Europe itself in that perspective, actually. On the other hand, 24% say that they are increasing more supply chains in China, which is in line with another subject we discussed before, which is China in China for China, and all of this has led to the trade imbalance getting worse that you mentioned in the beginning here. So still, with all these changes that are happening now, China's share of manufacturing in terms of value added has actually increased in recent years to around 30%.
What you said about the wages or unit labor cost, I think that's really interesting because, like over the last 20 years, that's all been the theme that our clients or corporate clients would say is that costs, wages keeps rising in China. So it's been tough. But from post-COVID era, because if you look at China's inflation, it's 0%, whereas the rest of the world is having at least 5% inflation. So China didn't have this wage inflation, but I guess it's still playing in the background. Another thing is that when you think about China, like most of the workers are rural. So during COVID, they just went back to their rural villages and towns. And so it kind of did this. There's no like work from home teams thing that happened as much. And so whenever COVID was over, people were very happy to just come back to the city to work. So the participation rate went up again, and they didn't have this labor issues that a lot of Western country has had. Then let's go to the next topic, maybe about electric vehicles. Good, Frederick.
This is interesting now because the EU has recently launched this anti-subsidy investigation into electric vehicles and steel and other products as well. I think the main reason behind all this stuff. I saw actually a speech by von der Leyen in the European Parliament. She talked about this and basically said that we shall not make the same mistake once more, where we let China completely dominate the solar panel imports into Europe when Europe is going through this energy transition. As we know, Chinese companies, I think, provided somewhere between 80 and 90% of all the solar panels in Europe. So she said this sort of led to a lot of very good European companies going under because Chinese companies were clearly supported with government subsidies, and hence they kind of dumped the prices. And we see this happening with EVs again, and we need to put a stop to this, and that's why we're launching this campaign. But I think China has overcapacity and cheap products almost everywhere you look. It's in aluminium now as well. It's even mentioned that pork. I haven't double checked this number, but it's said that pork is now sold 1 RMB below its production costs in China, and also if you look at the trade balance between EU and China, you see the trade deficit from a European perspective actually increasing. EU exports in volumes to China have fallen by a third since 2017. So for each container, and again, I'm referring to this report by the EU Chamber, for each container of goods from EU to China, there were 2.7 such containers from China to EU, and in 2023, this had increased to 3.9, meaning that each time China sold 4 containers of goods to Europe, basically 3 of them came back empty. Only 1 came back with goods. And that is, of course, a very extreme situation that further leads to tensions between EU and China.
The overcapacity issue, I see it in different data sets as well. So if you look at like loan data, for instance, as you've talked before, property sector is dead, so you don't have to extend loans to the property sector. So now there's all this cash that can be lent out to the industries, and that's where you're seeing it being sent. And then you have big investments from the government and the banks loaning to electric vehicle industries or semiconductors, and that's where I can see EU and US kind of getting upset because in a way, because the costs are getting so low, and then they're shipping them out, and it's reducing margins for the Western manufacturers. I mean, in a way, for if you're a consumer in these countries, it's actually a very good thing. But I think for a producer, that's where you're having problems.
I think we know where the red lines are for China, things that where China will not back down. But I think Europe is sort of approaching a point now where it has to decide what are our red lines in our relation with China.
Yeah, that's a good point because I mentioned about uncertainty about China's policy priorities. But when it comes to tensions, they know where it is, sort of. But from a Chinese point of view, looking at Europe, you don't really know where those tough lines are. Like, what is that thing that's going to push Europe over the line or US over the line? And I think that's where the Chinese leaders usually they have issue. It's not just Chinese; others have issues because of the election cycles that happen in US and Europe. That depending on who's in the seat, 2 years, 1 year, it can change quite a bit. So that clarity needs to come through. So Frederick, like taking all these things into account, geopolitics, costs, etc. So is China's dominance manufacturing, is that over? Kind of putting the spotlight back to you again.
Thank you, Sean. No, I think that would be an exaggeration, but things are changing fast. And as I mentioned before, well, actually, China's percentage of the value of goods manufacturing has actually gone up. So it's more that it's changing below the surface quite a lot, I think, and quite fast. that companies move manufacturing elsewhere now from China is partly a natural development. Of course, there's geopolitics in there, but there are other forces at play as well. And I mean, it's a natural development, as we mentioned before, that costs have actually gone up in China relative to some other countries. And the same happened in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. Earlier, they were very hot markets in the 70s and 80s. All these countries were huge importers of foreign direct investment, and that was for cheap manufacturing. But they all later also moved up the value chain to more of high quality manufacturing, while some of the low end manufacturing moved elsewhere. And that's also kind of partly the definition of avoiding the middle income trap that China is so keen to also avoid, not least because of its demographic situation and challenge. This moving manufacturing out of China, it goes for foreign companies, but it also goes for Chinese companies who already, over 10 years ago started moving low-end manufacturing elsewhere. And it was actually even a part of China's strategy under the Belt and Road Initiative that Chinese companies should go global, unless they should spread kind of their risks and look for opportunities outside the Chinese market. And they started setting up manufacturing in many other parts of the world. And they are also, when you look at what's happening today with manufacturing moving to Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and Mexico. I mean, Mexico just recently surpassed China as the U.S. biggest trading partner. And that's, of course, because a lot of U.S. companies move to Mexico, but Chinese companies are also moving to Mexico. So I think it's kind of an interesting aspect. It's more complicated than sometimes, the way it's described in media, etc. And just to sort of try to paint a picture of this, I just want to mention some statistic for foreign companies where this whole idea of in China for China that's playing out. If you look at foreign companies on an aggregate level, their sales in China in the domestic sales compared to export in 2006, foreign companies exported 7 times more out of China than they sold in China, and in 2012 they exported the same amount out of China as they actually sold locally in China. And then you look at 2021, the China sales was actually more than 2 times bigger than the exports from the same foreign companies operating in China. So China for China is really already a reality for many foreign companies. But some will also use, and this is also an interesting aspect, some will also use facilities in China for high-end manufacturing for China, but also for exports. And there are many examples of this, but if I take one more well-known example is Tesla, that has set up very very big manufacturing facilities in Shanghai over the past few years. And for them, not only is China's domestic market extremely attractive. I mean, China is the biggest automotive market in the world by far. I mean, it's more than twice the size of the European market, for example. But it can also be used for exports. And again, coming back to what kind of exports will we see from China now? And things are really moving fast. Another few numbers just to show what's happening. You look at the global exports of electric vehicles, so the global EV exports. In 2018, China stood for 4.2% of global EV exports, while Japan stood for 24.5%. And then 4 years later, in 2022, China's percentage or share of global EV export had grown from 4.2% to 35%, while the Japanese market share had fallen from 24.5% to 9.3%. So competition from China is happening in China, but it's also happening in the rest of the world, and it's coming regardless if companies have a presence in China or not. So when I speak to foreign companies executives, I went to a meeting as late as this morning actually here in Singapore. Foreign companies feel that they talk much more about competition in China now than they ever did before, but they also feel that they have to be in China to compete with Chinese companies in China in order to be competitive also outside of China, because the competition is coming, like it or not. But they also, of course, mention in a lot of these discussions that there is not a level playing field, as Chinese EV companies and many other industries also get a lot of subsidies from the Chinese government.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be tough in every direction that you look if you're a Western company.
And at the same time, for many of them, the Chinese market is one of the biggest, in many cases, the biggest market. So yeah, so these are more complicated issues we're talking about here.
Okay, very good. We're running over 40 minutes now, so I don't think we can solve all of China's issues in 45 minutes. Uh,
Well,
so uh,
we gave it a try at least.
so let's see if I can take have three takeaways from our talk today. First one, just about Taiwan China tensions. It's not resolved, but it seems like both sides will not be crossing the very dark lines that they've set for themselves. So, no major conflict based on the election outcomes. Second thing is on Chinese manufacturing. Low end moving up, it's a natural process of moving up the value chain. Um, but that will worsen trade deficit with the EU and China, and that's going to lead to more trade tensions. And then the third thing is about the Chinese property market. It is, in order to be solved, basically they have to get rid of this excess capacity, whether it's buying new property or providing some kind of guarantees. So it needs to be kind of changing the model so that there are more public sector involvement to help out.
I think we're sort of approaching a point where the Chinese government will feel like they need. I mean, everyone's disappointed with Li Chang's speech in Davos. He seemed to be content that the economy is in great shape, while a lot of evidence show that it's not. So I think that the way this is developing, China is probably coming closer to a point where they actually will take more action and more decisive action to prop up the economy. I think one aspect of this that we didn't talk about was, of course, monetary policy, where I think one of the reasons China didn't cut the interest rates that you mentioned in the beginning and do not look into QE or anything else that so many other countries are doing, that is simply partly because they, as Li Chang said in Davos, we don't want to create bigger problems than we already have, but it's also probably partly because the divergence between, in particular, the U.S. monetary policy, which is quite restrictive with higher rates and QT. If that divergence gets too big, of course, there will be a problem of potential capital outflows and pressure on the currency in China. So if that changes, which is quite likely, at the end of the day, the U.S. And Europe will always go back to, uh, if not QE, then at least a more supportive monetary policy. When and that happens, I think it will be a little bit less pressure for China, and they could potentially do more. If it helps or not is a different issue. The other thing I think to remember here before we finish is that considering the size of China's economy, being the second largest economy in the world, I think we should all hope for the Chinese economy to recover, because if the scenario is a hard landing for China or some very substantial problems, that will have much more a much bigger impact than only on the Chinese economy itself.
Yeah, the monetary policy thing is a good thing you brought up because when the stock markets are falling, I don't think it's such a big deal. But it becomes a big deal if it spreads to the currency and capital outflow because that can really destabilize the entire economy. So I think as the markets are pricing in, if the Fed starts to cut second half of the year, that is a major relief for China where the interest rate differential narrows and maybe they can ease policy more and be more supportive without worrying about capital flow. So second half, if the Fed starts to cut, I think that's actually really positive for China as well. And then, like you said, there are a lot of China bears are everywhere I look right now because the stock market's falling. But yeah, you gotta be careful of what you wish for because if Chinese economy isn't growing 5% and it's growing 2%, yeah, I think it is really hard for the S&P to be making new highs this year based on those assumptions.
And let's remember, the year has started badly for Chinese and stock markets, but we still haven't entered the year of the dragon. That's a few weeks into the future. So let's see. That should, according to the auspicious calendar that China has, lead to some potential support. We will see.
New hope for the year of the dragon coming up. Okay, thank you, Varric, again. It was a great conversation. And to everybody else, thank you for listening to SCB's Inside Asia. Talk to you soon.